So we've worked our way through the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel, and in chapter 1, Matthew introduced the Messiah to a Jewish audience. It's very important that we keep in mind that this was Matthew's target audience, because as we work through this particular Gospel, there are a lot of things that Jesus was saying that are only applicable to a Jewish audience, and they will become obvious when we get to them. But Matthew has established that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the King of the Jews as well, which we're going to get into a little bit this morning. Matthew mentioned that he was the son of David. That gave him the right to sit on the throne. But he also mentioned that he was the Son of God. He was born of a virgin. And that made, since the fact that he was God, that eventually when we get to the crucifixion, that he has the ability to pay for the sin of the world, as John the Baptist will say when he sees Jesus. And now that we're starting chapter 2, we're going to find that Matthew is visited by the Magi, sometimes referred to as the wise men. You hear people talk about, remember the song, "We three kings of Orient are..." They weren't kings. So we're going to get a bit of an idea of where that all comes from, but we have to understand something about these people. What do we know about the wise man? Well, there are numerous traditions about the wise man that are not based in fact. And by the way, as we're going to go through these things, please don't think that I'm telling you at Christmas time, when you put out your manger scene and you put the wise men there with the shepherds, that I'm saying, "Oh, you're a horrible person, don't do that." Let me tell you something. When we put out our little manger scene, the wise men are there, the camels are there, the shepherds are there. Matter of fact, we have 2 sets of wise men because I inherited my mother's set that she made for herself and all 3 of her children. So we have 6 wise men in our manger scene. We only have 5 camels, though, thanks to our second son, who was playing with a ball and tossed it and knocked it off of the shelf, and ceramic doesn't do too good when it lands on tile floor. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put that wise man back together again. But anyhow, one of the traditions is that they represent, this is an interesting one, they represent the families of Noah. And they are Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Where does that come from? I don't know. And there's no basis in fact for that at all. Of course, many of them, because of that, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they say that one of them was an Ethiopian. If you look at our manger scene, one of them is black. Because they came from Ethiopia. Now, I'm not sure how he got from Ethiopia to the east and then back to the west. But again, that's just one of those traditions that have come around. He probably, flew Delta or something like that in order to be able to accomplish that. Some of them have said they have names for them. We have Gaspar, not Casper the Friendly Ghost. This Gaspar with a G. And then there's Balthazar and Melchior. And if you've seen the Christmas shows that they've done all over the years, they give these people names. What I find interesting is the tradition that says the skulls of these 3 men are displayed in Cologne, Germany, in a cathedral. My first question is, how did they get them? And how do they know that they are the skulls of the 3 wise men? Was it like in their wills? They said, okay, you're going to forget the body, just save the skull. And we're going to need to put those in a church, a cathedral in Germany someday. I don't know. The cathedral, interestingly enough, was built in the 12th century that supposedly houses the skulls. But quite frankly, little is known about these men. A lot of it has to do with tradition. A lot of it has to do with trying to put pieces of the puzzle together, and that's what we're going to attempt to do this morning. Matthew doesn't write a whole lot about them. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at the history of these men. Not the individuals, but where they came from. And so we look at verse 1. Matthew wrote, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem." Now, What does Matthew say about them? That's it. Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Now he does tell us that they went to Herod, then they went to the house, and then they went back to their countries a different way. But as far as information goes about them, that is the extent of it. However, in the New American Standard note that is in my particular New American Standard, it says the Magi were a caste of wise men, and they specialized in astronomy, astrology, and natural science. So somewhere somebody got that information about where they come from. The Magi were believed to be members of an Eastern priestly group. Okay, maps here now, okay, folks? An Eastern group, okay, Jerusalem, Judea's here, Eastern is this way. So the Magi came from the east. What direction were they traveling? West. Because sometimes we don't think about that. Well, the Magi came from the east, so they must have been going east. No, if they did that, they would have ended up in India and then maybe China. Been a long way around, and after all, the world wasn't even discovered back then. So they traveled west. They also believed they were descendants of a tribe of the Medes. You may recall the Medes from Medes in the Persians, because the Medes and the Persians were the group of people that defeated the Babylonians. The Medes and the Persians, where they would be today, is Iran. It's sometimes referred to as Persia. That's the general area of where they came from. But prior to this, historically, you have the Babylonian Empire that had control of that. The Medes and the Persians defeated the Babylonians. You can read about that in Daniel. So they date back to the time, as I mentioned, the Medo-Persian Empire, and again, even before that, into the Babylonian Empire. It's interesting that the word Magi is translated as wise men in the King James Version. But the term is not gender specific. So we don't know for sure if perhaps there might have been wise women. Now I know men would say today, what would a sexist say? No such thing. That's what a sexist would say. But maybe I should delete that from the recording. But the word is not gender specific. And so that's why the newer translations use the term Magi. Because we don't know the gender, because it's not a gender-specific word. Magi was a name that was given to them by the Babylonians. It was given to a specific group of people. They were skilled in astronomy. They were skilled in astrology. They were also known as sorcerers. And they were mostly pagan in their religious beliefs. From Magi, we get our English words magic or magician. That's where that comes from. The Magi were in Babylon during the time of Israel's captivity. When Nebuchadnezzar conquered Israel, conquered the southern kingdom, Judah, he took captives back to Babylon, back to the capital where Nebuchadnezzar was. And of course, we can read in Daniel's book about them. We know it was Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, so we know something about them from reading Daniel. Matter of fact, that's where we're going to get a lot of our information from about the Magi, from the book of Daniel. So they had risen to prominence because of their knowledge. Not just of astrology, but of astronomy, studying the stars. Astrology is the superstitious part of that, where astronomy is the study of the stars. But they were very knowledgeable people. So the Magi are mentioned. Now, I'm not going to read all of these passages. It's just too much there. But I want to point out in Jeremiah, he mentions the Magi, and he specifically calls them the Rab Magi. Literally, they were the chief magicians. In Jeremiah 39:3, in Jeremiah 39:13, you see similarly they are mentioned there. But in addition to that, they are also mentioned by Daniel. Matter of fact, we probably have more information about them from Daniel's letter than we have certainly from Jeremiah. But we find, again, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 10, he refers to, in the New American Standard, they're referred to as magicians. That was the Hebrew word for magi. Just gives us a little understanding. They're also mentioned in Daniel 2:27. Similarly, they are mentioned in Daniel 4:7. Again, same thing. In addition to that, they are mentioned in Daniel 4:9, where they're called chief of the magicians. O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians. Now, who was that? That's Daniel. So he was chief of the magicians or the magi. So remember, as we read about Daniel, he rose in his prominence under the Babylonians, and even when the Medes and the Persians came, he still had a position of prominence in these different empires. But that's where we get a little bit of information from them as far as them being mentioned. Now, as Daniel, this is the last one, by the way, in Daniel 5:11. And again, he's appointed chief of the magicians. That's Daniel. So in Daniel, as he wrote, he was appointed chief, or he was the head of the magicians or the magi. So if we think about that, with Daniel's influence, it's not hard to imagine that Daniel certainly influenced the pagans that were around him. He certainly influenced Nebuchadnezzar. As a matter of fact, if you read about Nebuchadnezzar, personally, I'm of the opinion that Nebuchadnezzar became a believer in the true God. Now, it was after a period of 7 years of insanity that was prophesied by God through Daniel. But Nebuchadnezzar had a great deal of respect for Daniel. As a matter of fact, the Magi had a great deal of respect for Daniel as well. But we know he had this big influence in the lives of the Magi and certainly in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. His influence was probably made the pagan Magi familiar with the Jewish writings. And that would have been important as far as trying to get from the east to Jerusalem to find the newborn king of the Jews. And so through him, they probably knew, through Daniel, they probably had information about prophecies, about the Messiah, about how the nation of Israel would be restored one day. Because Daniel knew all of these things. You know, all these prophets that were speaking before Daniel's time, he had that information about them, and it's likely that he's the one who passed this information on to the Magi in general, and then the Magi that came to Jerusalem looking for this newborn king. So let's just share some of the beliefs of the Magi. One of the things that they believed was they had a very high reverence for fire. Now, they had an altar that burned a perpetual flame. And I want you to start thinking about these things because they're going to kind of fit the pieces of the puzzle together. As a perpetual flame, and it was supposedly kindled by God. This fire was a principal element in their worship. In addition to that, they offered blood sacrifices. They would kill the sacrifice, they would eat the sacrifice, the priest would eat the sacrifice, and also the person who was offering the sacrifice would eat the sacrifice. In addition to that, they had clean and unclean animals. And now what I want you to think about is this. Does it sound anything at all like some elements of Judaism? So, you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. You see the great influence of Daniel over the Magi, the position that Nebuchadnezzar put him in, and eventually his grandson would put him in right before the Persians destroyed the empire. And you see the influence that he probably had over the Magi. And it's no wonder that in their developing religious practices, they had elements of Judaism slipping into their practices because now they have information about Judaism. And it's just kind of putting pieces of the puzzle together. So the question then is, how did the Magi know about Jesus coming? Well, Daniel may have taught them the scriptures and the prophecies. Now, it's certain that not all of them would have believed it, but it would have been something, since they were people who were searching for knowledge, that they would have been interested in what Daniel had to say, particularly when you think about his influence in the Babylonian Empire. If Daniel was influential, though, people might ask, why the plot to kill him? Because you know the whole story about Darius. Darius was Darius the Mede. He was part of the Medo-Persian Empire, the one that took over the Babylonian Empire. But Daniel was so important, he even had a position in the Medo-Persian Empire. But somehow there was this plot, and if Daniel was so influential with the Magi, why the plot to kill him? But I want you to look at this for just a second from Daniel chapter 6, verse 4. The first part, it says, "At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so." This was a long time ago when you would investigate somebody in government and you couldn't find any wrongdoing. Just a thought for today. But I want to point out something here. The administrators and the satraps were regional governors. They were not the Magi. It was a total group of people. These people were involved in politics. And they saw Daniel's influence. So what they did was they tried to find something he was doing within his government affairs to accuse him to Darius over. And as Daniel says here, the book says, they found absolutely nothing. Zero, nada, nothing at all. So he was the one, now that he was important to the Magi, because if you remember, if you've read Daniel, Daniel was the one that saved the Magi. You remember from Daniel's book, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And he calls the Magi together and he says, interpret the dream for me. And so what do they say? Well, tell us what the dream is and we'll interpret it for you. And Nebuchadnezzar's like, wait a minute here. If you're really who you say you are, you tell me the dream and then you can interpret it. And they look at Nebuchadnezzar and they go, no one can do that. So then he gives them a little bit of time. He says, because if you don't come up with the dream and the interpretation, guess what? You're all dead men. Now Nebuchadnezzar, as the king at that time, had sole authority. He is absolutely sovereign. He could do whatever he wanted. So if Nebuchadnezzar wanted to kill all of the Magi, he had the power to do it. Daniel comes forth and he talks to him. And of course he says, give me some time. Daniel prays to God. God gives him the dream, gives him the interpretation of the dream. And then he goes back to Nebuchadnezzar, tells him the dream, tells him the interpretation. By the way, Nebuchadnezzar didn't listen to it. And then he spent 7 years insane because of it. But Daniel saved the Magi. So they don't at this point have anything against Daniel because after all, he was the one that saved him. It's the politicians that wanted to get rid of him. Some things haven't changed. Now fast forward from there, later in the 6th century BC, again under Darius the Mede, when he came to power, Darius is the one who put Daniel in the lion's den. And of course, we know the story about how God closed the mouths of the lions. There's a I don't know who this is that painted this picture. There's a painting of Daniel in the lion's den. And Daniel is looking up as Darius is opening the entrance to this pit. And you see all these lions. This is actually a painting. Just goes to show you how skilled these painters were. All these lions kind of in a semicircle around Daniel, and they're just kind of sitting there peacefully, and Daniel's looking up. It's like, yeah, God's in control. Beautiful painting. Absolutely beautiful painting. But Darius decreed, Darius was of the religion Zoroastrianism. It was then to be made the state religion of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, every one of you here that is above a certain age knows someone very famous who came from a family of Zoroastrianism. I'll give you his name. His name was Farouk Bolsara. Farouk Bolsara. Everybody knows Farouk Bolsara, right? You might know him better as Freddie Mercury. His family, they worshipped this religion of Zoroastrianism. Freddie Mercury was one of them, very famous person, obviously. I say it above a certain age because some of the younger ones might not recognize that name. Maybe I'm aging myself by just saying that. But to maintain power under Darius, eventually the Magi side with this to get rid of Daniel. And that's how Daniel ends up in the lion's den, because they went to Darius and they said, you know what? You're God, Darius. Everybody needs to worship you. So you pass a law that no one is to worship anyone for a certain period of time except you. Now they knew what Daniel did. Every day, Daniel, at certain hours during the day, he would look toward the west to Jerusalem and he would pray to God. And he would do it with his window open. Everybody knew that. And so Daniel does that as he normally does, and they go, aha, that guy Daniel. Now, just to show you the difference between the power of Nebuchadnezzar and the lesser power of Darius, Nebuchadnezzar had all power. He could decree something, he could reverse it. Darius, according to the Medo-Persian law, if he issued a decree, he couldn't reverse it. So Darius knew he was bound. They set Daniel up. This includes the Magi, because they wanted to get rid of his influence then at that point in the Medo-Persian Empire. But we know the story. And I love the part of the story where Darius gets Daniel out of the lion's den. And he's like, gather up all these guys. Toss them into the den. And Daniel's book says, before they even reached the bottom, the lions were upon them. I mean, after all, they went an entire night without eating anything. Daniel was not eaten, but that's God being in control. So, 600 years before Jesus was born, it seems Daniel planted the seed for the Magi to come to see the newborn king. And again, God is involved in this. You know, God has dealt with Gentiles as well as with the Jews, certainly more than the Jews, because he had a specific purpose for the Jewish people, which was to bring Messiah and Savior into the world. But the Magi are going to have a part in that. So the Magi, as we get into Matthew's Gospel, they come to see the king. So you have to understand the attention that the Magi attracted when they came to Jerusalem. In order to understand that, we have to know something about the historical events of the day. What was going on in Jerusalem, in the Roman Empire, in the Persian Empire when Jesus was born. Rome was uneasy about the eastern regions of their empire. That's where the Persians still were. And you know, one reason that they had concerns about it was because it was a great distance from the east to Rome. And Dave, they didn't have C-17s to transport the army there to where they needed them at a moment's notice. There was no quick reaction force that they could just deploy. So you think about the distance from Persia to Rome, and that would certainly be a concern when there's been history of turmoil in that part of the eastern end of the Roman Empire. That was a concern. So there had been rebellions in that part of the world. And so we look at verse 3 where it mentions this. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. So as we see here, Herod was troubled because the men were seen as king makers. Not kings, but king makers. And they came to Jerusalem, to the king there, and they were looking to find the newborn king. Verse 2, Matthew writes, saying, where, I know I did 3 and then I went back to 2, I'm aware of that. Saying, where is he who has been born king of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. So the question is, why was Herod panicked? Why was all of Jerusalem panicked? And so in order to understand this, we have to consider some overlooked facts of what was going on historically back in that time. Okay, first of all, let's just say something. The Magi and company likely rode on horses, not camels. Okay, I want to say again, if you want to put your camels out for your manger scene, don't think that I'm criticizing you, because this coming Christmas, Lord willing, when we set up our manger scene, we will have camels there. Now, our daughter-in-law told us that some pastor that she knows, not me, when he visits your house before Christmas and he sees your camels set up at your manger scene, you know what he does? He moves them. You do that in my house and you're not getting invited back. I wouldn't even think about doing something like that. The nerve of some people. It's not your home. Now, so they probably weren't riding camels. Most likely they would have been riding horses. Horses are faster than camels. Horses are more comfortable than camels. Camels were used at this time period, generally speaking, for pack animals, not riding on. There may have been camels with them to carry the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but they would have been riding on horses. But anytime you see the manger, they're always riding on camels. Okay, second thing we need to understand, they visited a house, not the stable. So again, I know why the pastor does that, because the Magi weren't there when Mary gave birth to Jesus. How do we know that? Because the Bible tells us the only ones that God informed at that point were the shepherds. They were the ones that were there. So, if you want to be historically accurate, put the shepherds in your manger scene and then put the camels somewhere else in your house. And every day as you get closer and closer after Christmas, you get closer and closer. Change the stable to a house and then have the Magi coming closer and closer and closer until they actually get there. But have more than 3. Because there weren't just 3. So again, tradition called the Epiphany, which is, by the way, celebrated for many Christian denominations. Epiphany happens after Christmas. And you know when Epiphany takes place? 12 days after Christmas. Does it kind of remind you of maybe a Christmas carol? The 12 days of Christmas. Now, please don't think that the 12 days of Christmas have hidden messages in there about Christianity. They don't. But that's when the Magi came later. They came to a house. And that's the reality. It doesn't say they came to a stable. It specifically says that they came to a house. By the way, the celebration of Epiphany, which is January the 6th, didn't even begin in Christianity until the 4th century. It's just a tradition that somehow got picked up and is just carried on. It's like Christmas trees. You know how many Christmas trees were in the stable? None. Now, don't go off the deep end and thinking, Pastor says you can't put a Christmas tree out. Please don't do that. I'm not saying. You come to my house at Christmas time, guess what you're going to see? A Christmas tree. Well, I don't have any horses, but if I did, they'd be there. So, in addition to that, they would have traveled, they were traveling with gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and they would not have traveled without an armed escort. That would not have happened. Because if you know something about those days, think about this. 3 kings wearing crowns, riding camels, going through the countryside. You know what's going to happen to the 3 kings riding camels? Just the 3 of them into the countryside? They're going to be 3 dead men laying on the side of the road, and their crowns and gold, frankincense, and myrrh is never going to make it to the house. They would have been robbed. It was unsafe to travel back in those days. And so if they would have been traveling, and they would have been people of prominence, kingmakers, after all, they would have traveled with an armed escort. There would have been soldiers with them, probably cavalry-type soldiers, riding on horses for protection. And so they traveled, again, this time when there were robbers. There was certainly, why do we get 3 wise men? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Okay, there's nothing anywhere that says there were only 3 of them. There were probably more than 3 of them. If it was a group of magi, likely there would have been more than 3. And they were traveling to Jerusalem. And you got to imagine this. If 3 guys on camels entered Jerusalem, what would that have done to Herod and the whole city? Absolutely nothing. Because camels came in and out of Jerusalem all the time, pack animals. They would have been traveling to and from all the time, except on the Sabbath. What would have stirred up Herod and all of Jerusalem? If from the east, kingmakers, a group of them came riding horses with armed cavalry, and they entered Jerusalem, that would have got everyone's attention. Not just a couple people, but the whole town, because they would have come through the gates. They were looking around at first, and then they're finally directed to Herod, who's the king. And after all, if a king's child is going to be born, where's the child going to be born? In the palace. But this is why all of Jerusalem was stirred up. They finally come to Herod, and they're asking him, hey, where's the newborn king? And that is a problem. So the next thing is, why was Herod so disturbed by the arrival of the Magi? We've already hinted at some of these things. But I want to point out, Caesar was the one who named Herod, and Herod was an Edomite. Herod was not a Jew. He was an Edomite. But Caesar was the one who named him king of the Jews. It's kind of ironic. What do we know about the Edomites? Go back in time. Who was the first one that was later to be called an Edomite? Anyone know? It starts with the same letter. Esau. Isaac and Esau. Jacob and Esau. Sorry, I got that wrong. Isaac was the father. Esau, his people later became the Edomites. They're not Jews. Matter of fact, the term Jew wouldn't even come into existence until long way down the road. But you have the line coming through Isaac to Jacob, and then his 12 children. They're going to be the Jews. They're going to be the Israelites. And there was turmoil between Esau or the Edomites and Israel. And of all things, Caesar appoints an Edomite and says, you are the king of the Jews. I have to imagine that didn't go over very well. But Herod was a ruler that had almost carte blanche when it came to what he did. Because Herod used force all the time, anytime he wanted. It didn't even matter if you were in his own household. If he felt something was going on that was against his little kingdom, he would have you executed, even in his own family. And he did that. So, of course, when this took place, when a group came to Jerusalem looking for the newborn king of the Jews, of course it troubled Herod, because he's the king. And of course it brought turmoil to Jerusalem. For one thing, they know what Herod is capable of. But then again, these soldiers on horses coming into Jerusalem, they know where they find out where they've come from the east. They know they're Persians. Not good. So now all Jerusalem is up in turmoil. But Jesus has already been born. They're just trying to find him. So again, what were the Magi thinking? Well, we really don't know. But when they got to the house where Jesus was, what did they do? They worshiped him. They bowed down and they worshiped him. Fast forward to verse 11. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother and fell to the ground and worshiped him. Then they, opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, how much time had elapsed from Jesus' birth to the time that they arrived? Well, we don't know. It was certainly less than 2 years. Probably, I'm guessing, about a year. Because when Herod is going to go in there and kill all the male children 2 years old and younger, you know what? When you look at a child and you don't have a birth certificate, how do you know that kid is 2? Well, when you have soldiers coming in and killing children and they come into your house and say, how old is your son? He's 4. He's 4. How do they know? They don't know. So they just look at a kid. Well, that kid looks like he's younger than 2. Why 2? Because Jesus was probably younger than that. So it's less than 2 years because they don't have birth certificates. So they're just going to kill all the male children less than 2 years old because they think by doing that that Herod is going to get Jesus. But he wasn't newborn anymore. I mean, I've looked at pictures now of our youngest grandchild, Jane. Get the name right. For some reason, I want to call her Ruth. I think they should have named her Ruth. I look at, we had the pictures pop up on the little Amazon screen as there's pictures of her newborn, and I go, she doesn't even look like the same kid because she just turned 1. Doesn't even look like the same kid. When babies are born, they're just like, and then when they're 1 year old, it's like they're everywhere. And it just gets worse. I keep telling my daughter that, well, you ain't seen nothing yet. So that's why we know that Jesus wasn't newborn. They came to the house, and when Herod sent out the soldiers, it's 2 and younger, because he's wanting to make sure that he gets this child. So what did they do? They bowed before him because he was God. He's the Messiah. If Daniel was teaching the Scripture, there's a chance he would have understood that. But they also gave gifts that were befitting a king. Now, why is Matthew including this? Because he's trying to show the Jewish people that this Jesus was no ordinary person. And he's going to be fulfilling prophecy, the virgin birth. It's in prophecy. Where he would be born, in Bethlehem, it's fulfilling prophecy. He's the king. It's fulfilling prophecy. That's why we have the genealogy through Joseph, because he has the right to the throne. And so Matthew is presenting this to this Jewish audience, and right from the beginning he's giving them the evidence that Jesus was who he said he was. And he is a king. And a king deserves to be worshiped, to be bowed down before, and he deserves to be presented gifts that are befitting a king. So this was important for Matthew, again, to include in his gospel written to a Jewish audience. This is why these things were important. Magi, or wise men, had a history that dated back, as we've talked about, to the prophet Daniel. And they recognized somehow through maybe what they learned or revelation from God that Jesus was God. And he's also the King of the Jews. Because what did they say when they came to Jerusalem, when they came to Herod? They said, we are looking for the newborn King of the Jews. This was revelation from God. This was perhaps what they learned from Daniel. But Matthew is pointing out to his Jewish audience, there's the evidence. The kingmakers recognized him as the King of the Jews. Not Herod. Herod's an Edomite. It's Jesus going all the way back to Abraham through Joseph. He has the right to the throne. It's ironic, though, that a group of Gentiles were the first to recognize that Jesus was God and that he was King of the Jews. Gentiles. By the way, who was the first person that Jesus revealed to that he was the Messiah? Long before Pilate. The woman at the well. And what was the background of the woman at the well? She was a Samaritan. So the first to recognize Jesus as King of the Jews were Gentiles. The first that Jesus revealed to that he was the Messiah was a Samaritan, a half Gentile, half Jew. I always find that interesting that that's how this unfolds. But Matthew is concentrating on Jesus as the rightful king, as the Messiah, and then, of course, later to be the Savior of the world. So, again, why were the Magi important? Because they're more evidence to the Jewish people that what they said, what Matthew, Mark, Luke, all the apostles said about Jesus was absolutely true. And they could trace it back when the Magi came. I mean, this stirred up Jerusalem so much, you have to understand that people would have remembered when these soldiers and Magi arrived in Jerusalem, going back in time. You know, you could see it in a Jewish family. Maybe they were reading this and going, oh yeah. I mean, I was just a kid when this happened. But I remember all of the turmoil that was in Jerusalem. We had never seen Persian soldiers before. And all of a sudden, these horses come in, soldiers on them, these men who are called the kingmakers, they're riding in and they're asking Herod, where is the one born king of the Jews? I remember those things growing up as a kid. We heard that stuff. Matthew wants them to know the evidence is there. And so we also, even today, we can see that just even at the beginning, there is more than enough evidence that Jesus actually was who he is, who he claimed to be, that he is the Messiah, that he is also the Savior of the world, not just for the Jewish people, but for the Gentiles also. And that's what Matthew wants them to understand, and still to this day wants us to understand as well. Let's pray.